The built environment accounts for a significant share of the world's greenhouse gas emissions. And while we usually talk about the carbon it takes to heat and power our spaces, today we are tackling a critical piece of the decarbonization puzzle: embodied carbon, the hidden emissions in the materials that make up our buildings and infrastructure. Joining us is Anish Tilak, who manages RMI's Carbon Free Buildings program and leads projects in the Pathways to Zero initiative. With a background as a licensed architect, Anish has worked extensively on net zero energy design, and now at RMI, he's creating scalable approaches to decarbonizing the built environment. In this episode, we'll break down why embodied carbon matters for cities and how policies like Buy Clean and Buy America are shaping not only sustainability efforts, but also domestic manufacturing and job creation. We'll explore how cities and developers are navigating these new standards and what the shifting political landscape means for the future of building materials. I'm Kate Gasparro, and this is Building Better Cities. You have been working for RMI for a bit, and specifically in the space of embodied carbon. And it has been a hot topic over the last 4 years specifically. And decarbonization is the overarching goal. Can you explain what embodied carbon is and why addressing it is critical for achieving decarbonization in the built environment?
Yeah, I'll start with some broad statistics that show why this issue is important. So if we look at the kind of global annual carbon emissions, buildings account for 40% or so. And so buildings as a sector is a really large piece of the pie for addressing global greenhouse gas emissions. And then when you zoom in even further to that 40% of just the building sector, what you find is that embodied carbon is about a third of that. And so if we then go back to like that big pie of the whole world and all the emissions, embodied
Mhm.
carbon, building materials and construction is 11% of annual greenhouse gas emissions. Embodied carbon refers to the what we call upfront greenhouse gas emissions associated with building materials.
Mm.
So there's a ton of different materials out there. The large emitters are sectors like the concrete and cement industry and steel industry. But if you look around the space that you're in right now, there's likely upwards of 20 different material chemistries that are making that space up. And each one of those has its own manufacturing process. And so what we're looking at with embodied carbon is the emissions that go into producing that material. And also throughout its life cycle, how durable is it? What happens when that material is taken out of the building and potentially landfilled? How can we reuse materials, improve circularity? So embodied carbon kind of captures all of the emissions associated with the life cycle of materials.
Recently, I guess relatively recently, there's been more policy around bringing material manufacturing back to the United States. I want you to talk about that, but also about this layer about Buy Clean, which has been the federal policy around embodied carbon and decarbonization of materials in the built environment. And can you sort of talk through how the Buy America policies and the Buy Clean policies are helping cities and developers, whether that's of infrastructure or real estate, move towards this building decarbonization journey?
Yes. So the intent of Buy Clean is to use the large purchasing power of governments to create demand for lower carbon alternatives to building materials. So when we look at the federal government and specifically the General Services Administration, which is the agency that owns, operates all of the federal government's real estate assets, GSA is the largest single buyer on the planet. So if GSA decides to ask for lower carbon building materials, that's a huge market signal to send to the suppliers of building materials. And it starts to change the way that markets are looking at this issue. So Buy Clean started at the state level. California was the first state to enact a Buy Clean policy. in, I believe, 2017. The way Buy Clean works is it's organized by specific material categories. So you'll see steel, cement, concrete, insulation materials, and others. It varies by jurisdiction, but it's organized by each of these material categories.
How is that related or not related to Buy America as a partner or sibling policy?
They do build off of one another. I think that the intent behind Buy Clean, one, is to reduce environmental impact, but
Mhm.
also to help to create jobs in the United States. Sort of think about it as like an onshoring jobs program, because what many people don't realize is that our domestic manufacturing is a lot cleaner than some of the international sources of our building materials. So if you're purchasing cement from a US based company, it potentially is cleaner than an alternative from Vietnam or Turkey or some of these other producers of cement. So by choosing to buy clean, you're also, in a way, buying American because you're asking for cleaner construction materials. And in many sectors, the American alternatives are cleaner.
Hmm.
We like to talk about buy clean and also embodied carbon reduction more broadly as a really great opportunity to build strong economies in manufacturing, bring back industry, help kind of transition our domestic production facilities to this climate aligned future.
And maybe if you could pick one or two materials, you talked a little about cement, you've talked about steel. What does it look like to make the manufacturing processes for those materials greener?
So I'll talk a bit about steel because I think steel as an American manufacturing sector is one that has a lot of history and people feel connected to it. So steel traditionally had been in the US made with blast furnaces, and that's a very thermally intensive process. You're using a ton of coal resources to fire up these blast furnaces. You're also using some of that coal and coke in the actual production of the steel. There's currently a lot of clean steel that's coming out of an alternative production technique called electric arc furnaces. So those are electrified furnaces that are making steel. The electric arc furnaces are primarily using scrap steel, though. So they're really good for recycling steel that's already being produced for another use and you're recycling it.
Can you talk through another material as well?
Sure. So we can talk about the concrete industry since we've been talking about steel and concrete. They're globally as industries, each around 7 to 8% of the globe's carbon footprint. So focusing on these sectors is very important. So concrete itself, unlike steel, is not a product that you're purchasing from a manufacturer.
Hmm.
The concrete supply chain has a bit more steps in its value chain. You have cement, the cement coming to a ready mix facility. Ready mix facilities then take that cement, they take aggregate, which is rocks, and they take water and they're blending those things together and making a ready mix product. So the first way to reduce the carbon impact of concrete is to reduce the most carbon intensive part of it, which is the cement.
Hmm.
And so there are supplementary cementitious materials or SCMs, which are filled in at the ready mix facility to reduce the amount of cement. Things like fly ash, which is an effluent of coal power plants, or slag, which is an effluent of steel making blast furnaces. So using those products in a concrete mix will reduce the amount of cement and then reduce the amount of carbon that that mix is producing.
Yeah. So you're talking about steel, which is mostly a carbon emitting manufacturing process that you're trying to green up through different types of energy sources that manufacture versus concrete, which is more of a chemical reaction on site when you're taking the different type of chemistry that can replace the cement in concrete to reduce carbon emissions there. In a perfect or ideal world where you see both of these technologies being pushed to really their limit, maybe not an ideal world, but maybe a possible world in the next few years, what do you think that 11% of global emissions could get to if we were to, go ahead and green up the manufacturing process or find better chemistry for these carbon emitting materials?
That's a really good question. I don't have the statistic on me, so I wouldn't want to misstate that. When folks ask questions like that, which are asking about percentages from the total pie,
Yeah.
the real challenge with climate projection is you don't know how those percentages are going to change over time too. In terms of like absolute numbers and targets that these industries are putting out there, the Global Concrete and Cement Association has a net zero roadmap that they have visioned out that takes and sequences the different reduction strategies for the global concrete and cement industry. So there's a target, there's a roadmap to get there.
You originally introduced Buy Clean as a policy that the federal government uses for its own facilities. And I have an inkling that they're probably also requiring anyone who uses federal dollars to also pursue Buy Clean. Can you speak to that? Is that what's happening, or is GSA really the only client of Buy Clean right now?
That's a great question. So when we're talking about embodied carbon reduction policies, really two types. There's mandates or requirements or regulations, and then there's incentives. At the state level, like in California, there is a mandate that state agencies buy clean. At the federal level, it's an incentive policy. The Buy Clean program at the federal level is funded through the Inflation Reduction Act, and it provides grants to GSA to buy clean materials or for departments of transportation to buy clean materials. A next step could be showcasing that this program was a success and then moving it to apply to all federal procurement, or if a state's getting federal dollars, doing a match program for Buy Clean. But that's sort of a next step and not currently where the program is.
Okay. And it seems like the current step is really looking at the EPDs, or environmental product declarations, for these materials to understand really what the baseline is in the greenhouse gas emissions or carbon emissions of the material, and roadmap out what could be done to improve upon that. What is sort of the breakdown right now between the information gathering and then the baselining and then goal setting and steps to get there?
Yes. So as you mentioned, the nutrition label that's used to measure all of this is the Environmental Product Declaration, or EPD. And the first step for any Buy Clean policy is measurement. So understanding what the emissions associated with you're buying are. So collecting as many EPDs as possible and then doing some type of benchmarking. I feel like the industry has moved pretty rapidly from a place of we don't have enough data to benchmark to a
Hmm.
place where now there are enough EPDs in the market, at least in certain regions, that we can develop clear benchmarks, understand where the market is, understand what the average, and then benchmark against that. So California has set benchmarks for its Buy Clean program. The federal government, for its incentive program, has set benchmarks. What's really exciting is the Inflation Reduction Act funded the EPA to actually develop a national labeling program for embodied carbon.
Hmm.
So they have 4 material categories that they're focused on: steel, concrete, glass, and asphalt.
California seems to be a leader in this space, which is not surprising. Can you talk through what other jurisdictions have adopted most quickly and why for buy clean?
Sure. Before we get ahead of ourselves with lauding California by clean, there is one material that is not currently included in California by clean that we've been talking about, which is concrete. So
Hmm.
interestingly enough, California does not cover concrete under its by clean program. Part of that is it's a huge state. There's a lot of geographical diversity in terms of the ready mix supply chain here. Southern California looks a lot different than Northern California. So there was a sense that having a state level target might be really challenging. And so other states to highlight here, the state of Colorado has a really ambitious buy clean policy,
Hmm.
and states in the Northeast like Massachusetts, New York, New Jersey, and then Midwestern states like Wisconsin, Illinois, Michigan. Not all of those states have enacted the policy and have set aggressive benchmarks, but all of them are working on buy clean in some form and trying to create these regional markets for lower carbon construction materials.
Yeah. I could see how states would be incentivized because, as you were saying at the beginning, it's also a jobs economic driver and diversification of industry for them that has follow on effects, not just for the built environment, but I can imagine for automotive or for different manufacturing processes. If a state is picking this up and wants to herald a buy clean policy, are they just using their building stock and development programs as a driver for the supply market? I can imagine that switching over to a different type of chemistry for concrete or switching to a more green electrification process for steel could be more expensive. And is the government just saying, hey, we will pay that premium, or we're going to subsidize up front the switch in these processes, or we're going to invest in research and development that will bring down the cost? So, can you identify really what first is that financial or economic premium for switching this over, if there is one, and then how states that are enacting these policies are trying to overcome that?
I'm glad you asked that question because it's really the heart of the discussion right now. So, buy clean policies, as they're currently designed, are really trying to move the floor up and eliminate the worst performing materials from an embodied carbon perspective. And a lot of the ways for producers to get to that are low hanging fruit. There's simple things that they can do to just improve their carbon emissions by 20% or more in some instances. And most of those are low or no cost changes. So when we talk about buy clean, it's primarily a no or low cost alternative that shouldn't change project budgets for the public agencies that are using these materials. But as we talked about earlier, the goal of all of this is to support decarbonization of these sectors like steel, cement, etc. So the question of what happens next, how does that embodied carbon benchmark for those materials get lower over time to get to that zero target?
Because we've talked a lot about how government agencies are right now the guinea pig for this policy. How do you see this rolling out into the private sector? And what are the incentives or goals a private sector developer or infrastructure developer would have to think about to be inclined towards buy clean as they're planning their own projects?
Sure. So one straightforward way to bring this to the private sector is through building codes.
Mhm.
So building off of the success of California Buy Clean, California has adopted the country's first embodied carbon provision in building codes, and it applies to commercial buildings that are larger than a certain square footage. So it's really focused on a small section of the private market, but
Hmm.
through code, it's signaling to the private sector that this is an issue that they should be addressing because in the future, that square footage threshold will get lower and lower.
Hmm.
And again, these are to capture no low cost, low hanging fruit. Broadly speaking, though, there are incentives relating to reducing embodied carbon beyond just the buy clean reduction strategies. Developers can find value in reducing embodied carbon through things like material efficient design.
Hmm.
So we've been talking just about switching material, but there's also material reduction. So do you really need all of that steel to meet the functional needs of your building? Do you need all of that concrete? Is the structure over designed? And so there's ways that you can capture cost savings from just hard costs associated with how much material you're buying
Hmm.
that will also provide carbon savings.
Would developers be looking towards architects and engineers to help educate themselves on that reduction, on even the material selection process, and also the supply chain as well? Is that their first go-to expert in this space?
Yes, I would say that the architecture and structural engineering communities in specific have really robust capacity at this point for the embodied carbon issue. They have been some of the strongest advocates for embodied carbon reduction policies. And for real estate developers, they're the first kind of sort of point of contact in the planning process for a project that can really help to get these integrated design solutions that reduce embodied carbon before that's the project's designed. So there are measurement tools for that. There's a process called whole building life cycle assessment, which
Mhm.
is a calculation to understand how much of what material is used in your project and what is the embodied carbon associated with that in aggregate over the whole
Mhm.
building, rather than what we've been talking about with buy clean, which is let's just look at the concrete that's here and then let's pick the cleanest concrete. And
Mhm.
so architects and engineers that are doing these whole building models are finding great solutions to reducing embodied carbon before you get to the point where you're just picking materials.
So I've worked with lead for buildings and construction. You are well versed in that space. And if a developer is looking to signal that they have a green building that's not only performing at that environmental standard, but exceeding it, lead is a great tool and market signal for that. Also, I feel like the buying or renting population is becoming more attuned to these sustainability factors. What are other drivers for why a developer on their own would decide they want to take a look at embodied carbon?
Yeah, I think that the value proposition and cost savings that we've been talking about related to integrated design, there's the value associated with green building assets, like having lower vacancy rates, demanding
Hmm.
higher rent premiums. So, those are really two clear value propositions. There's also, corporate climate disclosure as well. So we're seeing markets around the world really, and when I say markets, I mean governments around the world asking for carbon disclosure from companies that operate in those jurisdictions. And so there's an incentive there for real estate developers to calculate what their emissions impact is and then report it and optimize it. These are, again, at the very start, low hanging fruit. So why not do something that's going to earn you points?
Right. And you sort of be remiss without talking about adaptive reuse because the most sustainable building when it comes to embodied carbon is the building that's already built. How has adaptive reuse become a part of or separate from the embodied carbon conversations that you're a part of?
I think the building reuse, adaptive reuse focus has been very strongly connected to embodied carbon reduction policies. And we were talking about, buy clean for an extended period, but there's been a lot of movement in enhanced circularity policies, I should say. So things like deconstruction policies that reduce construction waste from sites that are being developed, and building reuse is one of the pathways in California's embodied carbon code provision. So there are policies that are incentivizing adaptive reuse, or at the very least saying if you're reusing a building, you're exempt from these other pathways like buy clean or whole building life cycle policies. There will likely be more focus on that in the future, especially given higher vacancies in commercial real estate and a desire to utilize those buildings better. It's a big question on how we can kind of create a financial incentive there tied to embodied carbon. I'm particularly interested in how, say, green bonds or sustainability linked loans could be tied to adaptive reuse projects, and then provides a loan discount for real estate developers that are doing the right thing and reusing existing buildings. There's also smaller developers that maybe work regionally and don't have the scale to really attract that type of bond mechanism. So, like, is there a way to aggregate project types like adaptive reuse and underwrite a green bond focused on that? To be determined. That's something that my team at RMI is interested in talking to financial institutions about.
Very cool. Want to talk through the shifting political landscape. Buy Clean was a policy that emerged under the Biden administration. Today we're recording on Inauguration Day. So we're about to enter a new future, one that might not be as sustainably oriented. And I'm curious, as a federal policy, what do you see the future of Buy Clean being?
There's a lot of open questions today on what will happen. In my mind, I feel optimistic about Buy Clean as a category of climate policy because, as we talked about earlier, it is a jobs program as well. It's about onshoring manufacturing of these critical building materials to the United States, doing them cleaner. And you see across the globe that there's going to be demand for cleaner construction materials. And so it's just a strong investment in our economy. So I think continuing to talk about embodied carbon reduction as a jobs endeavor, as a reindustrialization, or a trade endeavor, I think those are going to be how we continue to progress this policy. On the trade front, there's something called the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, or CBAM, which the EU is looking at, and I think already has, which would institute a tariff based on the carbon emissions associated with the good that's crossing the border. And in the US, we are entering a presidency that is very interested in trade policy and tariffs. So it'll be interesting to see how we can make a strong and compelling argument to this administration that Buy Clean is Buy American and it's good trade policy and can support the goals of the administration. Is not that different from how the Biden administration was talking about these issues. It's been the primary focus throughout their administration, is like, how can this actually help reinvigorate manufacturing? I think there's bipartisan consensus around that topic.
Thanks for tuning in to Building Better Cities. If you enjoyed today's conversation, be sure to hit subscribe so you never miss another episode. And if you could help spread the word by sharing with someone, it would mean so much to us. To learn more about our work, check out buildingbettercities.com. We're excited to keep the conversation going. So until next time, let's keep building better cities together.